Hi guys, so excited to be here. I'm Zubin from Open, and I'm working on a options protocol for DeFi. We're super excited to be working on a new version of the protocol, and super excited to have Hart and Rune, who've been thinking on some very similar questions as well. Might be helpful for you guys also to kind of introduce yourselves. Hart, would love to hear more about your background.
Yeah, sure. My name's Hart Lambert. I'm one of the co-founders of UMA, which is a protocol to build synthetic assets on Ethereum and other blockchains. And I actually come from a traditional finance background before getting into crypto a while ago. Yeah, I guess, well, Rune, why don't you you go ahead and introduce yourself too, and then we'll keep going.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Rune Christensen. I'm the CEO of the Maker Foundation and co-founder of the MakerDAO protocol. And so MakerDAO is a decentralized stablecoin protocol on Ethereum. The main product is the DAI stablecoin, which is a decentralized currency that's soft pegged to the US dollar. But the protocol also offers a peer-to-peer credit platform, essentially, where people are able to lock assets like Ethereum or Bitcoin and then actually borrow from the protocol. And that's how the DAI stablecoin is generated.
Yeah, kind of along this lines, one thing that you had mentioned was, kind of this community doing useful things for the protocol. And both, UMA and Maker have protocol tokens and decentralized governance to a certain extent. What has kind of been your experience as developers of decentralized protocols in trying to get a decentralized community excited, getting them kind of using these applications, getting them to have new updates to governance? It seems like a very interesting transition period for a DeFi protocol. What have you learned in the process? What do you wish you had known earlier, and what has kind of surprised you? Let's start maybe with Rune.
Yeah, it's definitely been a pretty intense learning curve, I think, for the Maker community. It's completely transformed itself multiple times over, what is it, almost 6 years now that the project has existed. And I think I really think that one of the most key takeaways that I think is, like, if you get it wrong, you're just never going to, like, it's sort of one of the most important things to deal with when you're actually founding and you're bootstrapping the very early stages of the community. And that is that there's kind of like a sweet spot in terms of the complexity that you can control through decentralized governance. So what I mean is, if you don't give people enough control, basically, if you don't give the governance community enough levers to manage, then it's just gonna, like, it's not really exciting, right? You're not gonna see any engagement. But it actually also exists on the flip side, right? If you create too much complexity and just like too many levers, too much stuff, you just create analysis paralysis, right? And you will completely overload your community. And if, like, where we want to go with decentralized governance, right, and the decentralized community is always towards kind of like an equilibrium, right, where you have a self-sustainable community that can operate a protocol and really just like maintain that stable equilibrium of sustainable growth. And it really is kind of like like a very sort of an art form, I would say, almost, to like shepherd a community towards that equilibrium, right? Where you have to make sure that basically the community's understanding of what they're governing evolves alongside those levers being exposed to them and the complexity being opened up. And I think, so that's something that we've constantly grappled with in the Maker community, right? Where there's like been periods where we might see things like there's just not enough stuff to decide for token holders, for instance, and then they start like playing around with the rates or something because someone's like, they're bored, they got to do something, and they're gonna start messing with the rates. And on the other hand, there's also been plenty of situations where the development team has sort of like dropped some sort of super advanced, like here's like 2,000 decisions, you know, what do you think, right? And then the answer is there's just no answer, like you just don't even get a response in that kind of situation. And it's really, yeah, like it takes a lot of I would say like, well, I guess like intuition to try to hit that proper sweet spot where the thing, like the knowledge of the community really is able to like expertly and actually properly control the governance levers so that you get the outcome that you want, right? You get a positive outcome.
Right. So it's about not changing too many variables at once, but also making the decision space sufficiently interesting and meaningful.
Yeah, and then of course, I think actually something that's super important to then also mention is that there has to be that like clear direction towards total decentralization, right? I really think that you can't have any sort of like compromise in terms of like a self-sustainable equilibrium for decentralized governance means that you must have like true decentralization, right? But then that's the thing where like the way to get to true decentralization is you have to take it step by step, because otherwise you know, you can create things like power vacuums and get stuck in and I think, you know, I mean, just to come with a recent example, right? I think if you look at something like SushiSwap,
Yeah.
as like an example out of the yield farming age, right? I think that shows this kind of dynamic where you can actually very easily have a situation where it's like you could almost have what's supposed to be a decentralized community get sort of like stuck in a particular state. Or another example is actually I mean, there was a literal governance takeover of the Steam platform, right? Which I think is another crazy, the crazy dynamics of decentralized governance, basically, which
absolutely
you have to be very careful when you navigate those.
Right. Hart, you know, kind of would like to get your thoughts. You've obviously launched a token at a very different time. There had been, you know, Rune to a certain extent, as you said, was an OG, original experimenter on some of these things. How have you felt, you know, what have you learned from kind of the projects of the past that came before, and then also what do you think you've learned in the time since launching a token?
Yeah, like, so Rune and Maker very much are the OGs that really kind of helped make out, provided a roadmap, at least some data points for how this stuff should work. And I think it's really interesting to the governance token has kind of become a buzzword too this year as something that people have, and it's supposed to capture value, and it's again a bit buzzword-y. What I'd say is, even like academically, the way I look at this, and I think it's kind of interesting, is if you think about a traditional corporation, a corporation has shareholders who elect a board of directors, who then elect a CEO. And you have this principal agent problem where the shareholders hope the board of directors do what's in their best interest, and the board of directors hopes the CEO does what's in their best interest. And you have like this incentive structure gets constructed this way. And if you think about it, that traditional corporation is structured that way because there's no way you could, for example, have Amazon be run by its shareholders as like decent. Like Jeff Bezos could not have all the decisions he has to make be run by the shareholders. I think we can all kind of agree that would be a disaster because there's so much complexity here. What I think we're trying to do with these protocols is we're trying to keep them simple enough so that you don't have a CEO and you don't have even a board of directors. You actually have a simple enough protocol that the shareholders, who are not shareholders, right, to be clear, these aren't securities and all other kind of stuff, but the shareholders, the token holders, the community can actually govern, can make the decisions that are going to point the protocol in the right direction.
Right.
And I think Rune's point about a sweet spot of complexity is, I mean, intuitively spot on, right? I haven't thought about it this way, and I'm glad he shared that. Intuitively, you want the shareholders, the token holders here, to be able to do their job. If you give them, like, if they have to make super complex decisions, they'll just fall flat on their faces. But you also need to keep them engaged in what they're doing. And then lastly, the other thing that would be kind of interesting to get Rune's perspective on is I think you have to incentivize your token holders here too. So one of the things that I don't know if Rune would agree or not, but you know, MKR holders aren't incentivized to vote outside of the fact that they're supposed to. Right. And I think that that's a kind of interesting point here too. That like it's too bad MKR holders don't vote in higher participation rates right now.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah,
so
that I'd like to talk about because that is a key issue that basically is constantly thought about in the community and discussed. I mean, my perspective is basically that it's completely true that you want maximal voter participation and you don't want voter apathy and so on. But basically, I always argue that the problem is that in most cases, what's basically being, what gets offered up as a solution, in my opinion, is like a naive solution, right? So something like, I mean, and the Maker protocol, just because of how the voting system works, it's sort of based around, it's really based on like it's designed around maximal resilience in terms of like flexibility of like things like if the front ends get turned off, or if if everyone all the people who trust it turn out to be corrupt and you have to just go, the websites get taken down and that kind of stuff. What kind of dynamics then unfold in the governance system, right? This is one of the reasons why it has a very dynamic quorum, for instance, that's based around how many people are actively voting. And then, I mean, like basically all protocols have some sort of form of like, dynamic quorums, or at least the concept that, the more people vote, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to pass more proposals, for instance, right? Because you might as well have people that vote against proposals as well. And so the basic issue that I think you run into when you try to incentivize voting is that the problem is that you actually you basically run into the exact same issue you already have, right? That like the question is, do people actually care enough to like vote in the best protocol? And if they don't, if you start paying them, what's stopping them from just voting something random, right? And specifically in the Maker protocol, the issue is that the protocol kind of assumes that if you're not really being very specific about how you vote, then typically what ends up happening is you just vote no. Like you just end up sort of creating more raising the quorum essentially in governance. So that gives the Maker protocol specifically much more like direct, I guess, confrontation with this issue of, are people actually voting altruistically? Like, are they really trying to vote in order to improve the protocol? Or are they just trying to capture this this incentive? Because the problem is then if most people just voting to capture the incentive, then having a voting incentive will actually slow down governance and will actually make it harder to pass proposals. So, I mean, I really hope that this is an issue that can be solved. I just think it's a very complex, like I think the solution necessarily has to be complex to some, or at least it has to sort of involve the concept around figuring out what is the right, what's a good vote and what's a bad vote, what's a good decision, what's a bad decision. You have to actually be able to like create a broader framework for that, in order to be able to to answer the question of when to pay out an incentive basically, and when is someone just voting randomly. Right. But I think other really important innovation that, I mean, pretty much everyone else has, Maker doesn't have it yet, right? But that's delegation. I think that's kind of like the saving grace, and at least I have very very high hopes for delegation in the Maker protocol as being the thing that can really inject some new dynamic in how Maker governance works.
Right. Awesome. It seems like a pretty difficult problem, but one that is so fundamental for keeping DeFi decentralized. And it's so interesting to see the work that you guys have both done from that perspective. Shifting gears a little bit, it seems like a big difference between DeFi and CeFi or traditional finance is just capital efficiency, right? When two counterparties in the traditional markets do a large position, either a loan or a derivatives position with each other, usually they don't have to put up, full collateralization or even over collateralization, right? And so you have these fractional reserve systems, you have margin trades, you have kind of leverage that's baked into most of these kinds of positions. To me, that seems like a big unlock for DeFi, is like solving this exact problem. How, you guys have been kind of working on systems that have full or over collateralization, but I'm sure you've thought about this question a lot. What is the unlock here? How do you see DeFi evolving to answer this question? Is it identity? Is it using real world assets, which are themselves leverage, which is kind of, it seems like, Ruin, you've been thinking about this a little bit more. Where do you see DeFi solving this core issue, and what gets you most excited? Let's start with Hart.
Yeah, so Zubin, I might reframe your question slightly here, where I think there's a difference between secured lending and unsecured lending. And then I'll also say there's like a difference between like margining, right? So most loans in this world are secured loans, where you are borrowing against an asset and you are not borrowing more money than that asset's worth. So just take a house, for example. I have $1 million house and I can borrow like less than $1 million against the value of that house. And this makes perfect sense. Yeah, this makes perfect sense. And really what finance is acting here, what it's doing is it's transforming illiquid assets to liquid assets, or vice versa. And Rune can talk a lot more about this, but I look at Maker as very much being this credit facility where you take an asset and you borrow against it. So it's secured, right? And to me, this is a crypto native concept, because everything is secured by the blockchain. You can observe collateralization ratios, and you can observe and make sure that all these loans are correctly collateralized. It all makes sense. The other type of loan that exists in the traditional finance world is unsecured lending, where you're actually borrowing against someone's credit. So I'm going to lend Zubin money on a credit card because I know Zubin and I have some thing about him. And to me, this is really interesting, but it's far less crypto native, because it fundamentally involves a concept of identity. In order to do an unsecured loan, I need to know who that person is or something about them. And maybe there's like proxies for identity. Maybe I can look at some history of their activity, or I can have people vouch for them. There's like really interesting work to do there. But to me, like, unsecured lending is just actually a very different problem for in a crypto setting, because of this fundamental like tie to identity.
Right.
And yeah.
Here's a follow-up question on that, right? It's like the house or the car that you're lending against, right? When you take an auto loan or a mortgage, you can use those. They're fundamentally like have a lot of utility as assets. Do you see like some kind of interesting unlocks there? Does a C token already look like that? Compound, which represents compound loans. What do you see as the equivalent here? Because when you lock up ETH to borrow DAI, you're not able to use that ETH anymore, right? In the same way that you can still live in the house. So what do you see as like the unlocks there? And do you see this as potentially like DeFi is good enough without, unsecured lending? This crypto native financial system can become really large without even, necessarily needing identity and leverage in that sense.
Yeah, I think of these as slightly different things, right? So if you think of like what DeFi exists right now is within crypto assets, I can borrow and lend against them. So I'm able to transform one crypto asset to another. So it's like this transformation thing. What I think is really interesting in terms of making it usable from like a real world perspective is I would like one of the assets I could borrow against to be real world, to borrow against my property or my auto or whatever. And that then requires some sort of like tokenization of that real world thing if I want to bring in a DeFi. And I think Rune can actually talk a lot more about this, about how, what that pathway might look like. And then Zubin, I can also talk to you about how, with derivatives, I actually think derivatives can this idea of real-time margining, like this is a completely separate concept, but we can come back to that later about how I think derivatives in DeFi can be hyper capital efficient, like hyper capital efficient. That's a whole other kind of worms. But yeah, Rune, like
I think I absolutely agree. Right, that's been the thing that I've been working on in research at Open with a couple of other folks as well. It seems like derivatives are a big unlock here for DeFi as well. But since we have Matt joining, welcome Matt. It's so excited to chat. Let me kind of give you a little bit of a kind of rundown of the questions we've been asking right now, and I think you would have a lot of thoughts on this. But specifically, we've been talking about the capital efficiency of DeFi assets, and tell me if I'm wrong, but TBCC is kind of a over collateralized asset as well. What do you see as like some interesting future directions to make DeFi more capital efficient, and what gets you excited when it comes to the question of capital efficiency as well?
Well, I've got a pretty probably different perspective than these guys, just because what we work on, the reason that we're inefficient, the reason that we require so much extra collateral is to ensure good behavior rather than to enable some sort of like synthetic or derivative. So I think the way that I look at this is that right now capital in the crypto space is not scarce, but that will not remain the case forever. So for TBTC, we're definitely looking at how can we lower the collateral requirements as much as possible. But I'd be really interested to hear, what Rune thinks, for example, when suddenly we're all competing for ETH with ETH2.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a great point, right? And I really think, I mean, the really big, actually, to completely zoom out, right? So I don't have a financial background. So the way I view this whole question is that, I mean, so to me, like secured lending and unsecured lending, those are kind of like these, specific terms in the financial world that means whether you put up, let's say, something physical, right? Something valuable, or whether you're just borrowing like against your character, your credit or whatever, right? Like, but basically from the DeFi perspective, or sort of from a more generalized perspective, in my opinion, there's no such thing as an under collateralized loan. Like the concept doesn't even make sense, right? Because a loan always, it's based on the concept of recourse, right? So no matter what, any sort of credit always has to be over collateralized, because otherwise you're not going to get, you would never ever borrow money from someone if whatever that person gets in return, whether it's your promise or your house or whatever it is, they would never ever, give you a loan of higher value than what you'll give them in return to ensure that they can get that loan back, right? So the way you can sort of, think about unsecured lending on the blockchain is simply if you can represent someone's, like basically their trust, right? I mean, their credit, essentially, the credit rating, you could even think of it like that. You could represent that as a token with some sort of value. Right. Then now you sort of, you put it into the classic, you could say DeFi paradigm of over collateralization, right? So where someone who can be really trusted a lot, and a legal claim against them of, could easily be of $1 million, and you could feel safe with such a huge legal claim because they're totally trusted, they have a great reputation, they have tons of assets and so on, right? And on the other hand, if someone can't really be trusted, then the value of their, a legal claim against them is just not going to be that great, right? So in practice, the way you would implement something like consumer credit in, let's say, Maker would be, for instance, you might have a company that has a ton of, that's financing a lot of credit cards or something like that. And then that company aggregates all of these lines of credit and has, into a single pool of aggregated value, you could say, right? And then ultimately that business can actually be tokenized and can be used as collateral in Maker. And if the loans, too many of the loans start defaulting or something, the overall value of that company might fall, and then that's where the Maker protocol might liquidate it or something like that, right? But ultimately, the point is that you can always reduce any kind of financial relationship to this paradigm of an over-collateralized loan. But then to the other point of ETH staking, because that's like a really exciting topic really on this whole this in this kind of from this perspective. This is where the amazing nature of blockchain and programmable smart contracts really starts shining, right? Because like first of all, you can actually like wrap ETH that is staking, right? There's this thing called Rocket Pool, for instance. That's an example of like wrapped staking ETH. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of other services like that, right? And what's cool is that you can actually use those as collateral as well in DeFi, right? The thing is, and this is like the key concept, like the key point is that ETH that's actively staking is always going to be more risky than pure ETH that's just like highly over collateralized, right? So ultimately, no matter what you choose to put as collateral into DeFi, you're going to have to pay, right? The riskier the asset you want to put in, the higher the rate, the stability fee, whatever that you have to pay will be. So there's always going to be a market for all these different options, I think. And obviously, the goal of the builders in DeFi should be to try to offer as many options as possible, right? So users can pick whatever they prefer.
Got it. Yeah, would love to get, Matt, your thoughts, because as well about specifically ETH 2.0 and competing. You had mentioned competing for yield. How do you solve that issue, or do you think that's just, do you use wrapped, like the ETH that represents like a staking ETH? Do you use that, and how far away do you see ETH 2.0 really being for this to be a real issue?
Well, what's interesting is I haven't been quiet about being kind of an ETH2 skeptic. Not in the sense of like the technological approach, just in Ethereum we have kind of an ecosystem that's premised on over-promising and then taking an extra 5 years or so to deliver. So normally I would say, well, we can wait. It's not a big deal, and I wouldn't worry. And if you look at how we've built some of the, like for example, our random beacon under TBTC, well, we did that because I was confident that ETH2 wouldn't ship in time relevant to our project, and that's what happened. That said, if you're going to be able to lock up ETH in a month, whether or not the rest of ETH2 is functional, that's still competing for yield. So I'm in the unfortunate situation where we've kind of handcuffed ourselves, where we don't have we've sort of taken the opposite approach to governance as Maker, right? So we don't have a way to onboard new collateral. And so I think I'm really optimistic about staking derivatives. I generally think, to Rune's points earlier, finding a way to properly represent and tokenize cash flow in addition to just like hard unproductive collateral is a great way forward in this space. But it's going to be, I think it's going to be tricky for our team, and I think that we're going to have to ship a V2 sooner rather than later. And if ETH2 is popular, many protocols who haven't thought about staking derivatives are going to be hurting, I think, because right now it's really hard to overstate. ETH is just sloshing around.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, what might be helpful for everyone is just a brief kind of high-level overview of your background and what you've been working on as well. We did that earlier. Would be super helpful.
Well, hi guys, I'm Matt Luongo. I have a toddler that threw a tantrum right before this panel, so thank you for all your patience. So my background is I built a Bitcoin company in 2014. I since started working on Ethereum stuff, in particular a Bitcoin Ethereum trust minimized bridge called TBTC. And I think what's probably interesting about my perspective is that typically we're governance minimalists, not because I think that it's bad, but just because a lot of Bitcoiners would prefer to not have majority governance, and also just a little bit more skeptical, I think, of the Ethereum ecosystem. I love the tech optimism, but I think a lot of the problems that we're going to solve in this space are going to be not just solved by technology. So that's me.
Are you scared of consensus instability and MEV and kind of the future for Ethereum, at least in the proof of work sense that it exists right now?
So, I mean, I love it, frankly. I think as a protocol designer, MEV is fascinating. It does not scream that this platform will become unusable to me. It just means that protocols need to be more clever.
Right.
So that's kind of been my takeaways so far. I think it's going to be really interesting. Like I think that Ethereum right now has kind of like accidentally landed in this really interesting spot of being proof of work, as well as obviously being expressive enough to build interesting dApps. And so I hope that it can maintain that as it transitions to proof of stake.
Right, absolutely. All right, I think we're just about done here. So what might be helpful is just a little bit of a wrap up. Kind of, what makes you optimistic about the space, or just a little tidbit on something cool that we may not have mentioned that we left out. I think we can go Hart, Rune, and then Matt to end it.
What makes me optimistic about the space? We are collectively, DeFi is all about designing incentive structures. Even Rune's last point, I like that. Like, unsecured credit doesn't make any sense. There's still an incentive structure. That's entirely accurate, right? In traditional finance, unsecured credit, no, it has some value. It's your credit. There's a credit limit, right? Everything we do is like designing incentive structures. And the thing that I think is really powerful is that when you get those incentive structures right, they're super, super powerful. They're kind of like overnight exponential explosive growth. And like, that's kind of what we saw with the yield farming bubble. So the part that I think just gets me optimistic and excited is that I do think it's DeFi as a group of mostly good-natured or good-hearted people that are actually pretty excited about trying to innovate in financial concepts, building incentive structures that I think could be really powerful. And that's quite fun.
Rune?
Yeah, I think this is what I always talk about whenever people ask me what's the next exciting thing, right? I think it's the coming intersection of real world finance and real world assets and then DeFi, right? And we've been talking about that in the maker community for, I don't know, 2 years or more at this point, right? As like the holy grail that's coming somewhere far out in the future. But now, actually, this month, the maker community is onboarding its very first couple of actual real world financing projects. And it's kind of like it's funny to actually make, you can make these real examples, because it's like basically the Maker protocol is right now considering whether to finance the construction of a number of auto parts shops, I think in the Northeast US or something like that, as well as some trade finance companies. And it's funny that now we actually get to see what does this actually mean? What does it look like in real life as it actually happens? And yeah, I mean, anyone who wants to follow along can just go to forum.makerdao.com. All of this stuff is actually just happening there, like completely in the community. Me personally, I haven't really been involved in this at all. Like, it's all been just unfolding because of the framework that's been put in place. So I think if we can prove that it can be done, it's gonna then, from there, it's just gonna start to happen everywhere in all of DeFi, right? And all of these protocols and systems and interactions and incentives will start to like take on a new dimension of actually being used in the real world to do real stuff at scale. And that's going to be pretty epic, I hope.
Absolutely. Going to be epic. Matt?
I mean, I think I'm the most excited that we're still here. So after 2017, after this very, very softly popped food coin bubble, we're still doing our thing. And I think every day that crypto is alive is another day that we've built legitimacy. You see it in Rune's work. You see it with the latest exchange where founders get arrested and it barely impacts prices. That's maturity that we're starting to see. I hope that we're also going to start seeing it in some of the protocol founders, and that we're going to see some more honest efforts. So I'd say I'm really excited about that. I'm also just excited to see a lot of the promises that I've been short on for a while. Some people are delivering. So we're starting to see actual trust minimized solutions. We're starting to see DeFi that is decentralized and not based on admin keys. So yeah, I'm a censorship resistant maximalist, and I'm glad to hear that that's where we're going.
Awesome. Yeah. And just to kind of wrap it up, what gets me most excited is the caliber of people, having people like you guys, super hungry, super curious, super smart, that are working in DeFi and solving some of the hardest problems. And I'm optimistic that we're gonna figure it out. Thanks so much, everyone. This has been really exciting to chat, and it really appreciate your time and look forward to chatting again in the future.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, Ruben. Thanks, IOSG.
Peace.